National electricity objectives include price, quality, safety, reliability and security of supply. The government is now intending to add emissions reduction to those objectives. You, the Australian Energy Regulator, have made a submission to the consultation process, the government's consultation process, on the draft National Energy Laws Amendment 2023. In that submission you said, quote, "The AER supports including an emissions reduction objective." This is support for a proposed government policy. Surely the very first value of the public service, the Australian public service, is meant to be impartiality. Why are you commenting one way or another on support for a government policy?
So I guess my objective from that would be that we are there to try and meet Australia's emission reduction targets in the least cost way. That's part of our job, and our decision making needs to ensure that happens, because our purpose as the Australian Energy Regulator is to ensure Australian consumers are better off now and in the future. And so when we assess what tools we need as the Australian Energy Regulator to actually be able to do our job effectively and to make sure that we can deliver upon that purpose, our considered view is that change to the legislation, to the objective for which we have to use our decision-making, is required and is important to us being able to deliver upon our purpose. So It speaks fundamentally to our role rather than to the government's policy.
So do you consider that the Australian Public Service values and code of conduct apply to you?
I absolutely do, Senator.
Do you consider that the Australian Public Service values of impartiality apply to you?
Yes, I do, Senator.
Why are you stating support for a proposed government policy rather than impartially commenting on your ability to carry it out?
I'm not commenting on the policy, I'm commenting on the importance of the change to the work of the Australian Energy Regulator. So in that regard, my obligation is to make sure that we have the tools we need to discharge our functions such that we can ensure Australian consumers are better off now and in the future.
I put it to you that you are breaching the Australian Public Service values of impartiality by advocating support for a government policy. I would like you to take it on notice to fully explain how advocating support for government policy in a submission is impartial.
So, Senator, as I've said, we didn't advocate support for the policy. We're advocating support for the changes to the laws that are required to enable us to do our function.
The Australian Energy Regulator, your words, supports including an emissions reduction objective.
That is the change to the legislation required to do our function.
You've taken a side on this debate even before it started. You're required to be impartial. Why were you not impartial? I don't accept your answer.
I hear that you don't accept my answer, but my answer remains that we have asked for changes, and we constantly and repeatedly ask for changes to legislation, and it's in our strategic plan that we'll do this when it's required for us to fulfil our strategic purpose, and that is to ensure that energy consumers are better off now and in the future. So Limb 4 of our strategic plan actually says we will inform debate about Australia's transition, and that's to ensure that we can do our job to make sure Australian consumers are better off now and in the future.
So I suggest you read the Australian Public Service Values and Code of Conduct.
I have, Senator.
The current objectives of price, quality, safety, reliability and security are sound objectives. What level of compromise on price or reliability are you willing to accept to achieve the objective of emissions reduction?
When it comes time for us to be able to consider the new objective with all of the limbs in it, including the emissions reduction objective, we'll need to think about the value of carbon emission reductions in the context of the target to achieve net zero at 2050, to ensure that the investments that happen in things like transmission or gas networks are consistent with achieving that goal at least cost to consumers, which is where that element of making sure consumers are better off now and in the future.
So my question, I'll say it again, what level of compromise on price or reliability are you willing to accept to achieve the objective of emissions reduction? You've now got a new objective.
I don't see it as compromise, Senator. I see it as optimising.
Can I take note of that?
Absolutely.
It'll be interesting in the future. What are you going to do if the objective of emissions reduction conflicts with those existing objectives?
So we will need to optimise against the current list of objectives, and the inclusion of emissions reduction will become another limb. Already today, Senator, we have to make judgments and choices between the existing elements of that objective. So we constantly have to be thinking about trade-offs on behalf of customers in terms of price, quality, safety and reliability, and we will be also considering emissions reduction in that context.
So I put it to you that there is no way that the objective of price, reliability and emissions reduction can be achieved at the same time. So which one will you prioritise?
Senator Roberts, I wonder if your questions are getting a bit accusatory. You've asked questions. Ms Savage is responding to your questions with her perspective.
I have constituents that are deeply concerned about electricity prices that have trebled in a couple of decades.
And you are open to ask your questions, but I'm just asking you to mind your manner.
Okay, thank you, Chair. But I'll say it again. I put it to you that there is no way the objective of price, reliability and emissions reduction, the facts show that, can be achieved at the same time. So which one will you prioritise? You've actually supported the government in its policy, so which one will you prioritise?
So, Senator, an example might help. So currently we have to think about price, safety, security, reliability. So when we make a judgment, we have to think about price and reliability, and those two things aren't always the same thing. More reliability can be higher prices, lower reliability, safety and security. We just talked about, in response to Senator Van's question, an example about abolishing gas connections. There's a safety issue there. And so we're always and constantly in our work needing to optimise across those different objectives within the national electricity and gas objectives, and with the inclusion of emissions, it will be the same type of task. We have to look at it in its whole, and we have to optimise across all of those objectives. So we do it today, and we'll be able to do it tomorrow.
My view is that the people who tell us wind and solar are the cheapest form of electricity are lying. If they are the cheapest form of electricity, why do we need to change the electricity objectives to include emissions reductions so they are favoured?
So an example might be, you're thinking about generation technologies. We do a lot of work with the Australian Energy Regulator in electricity and gas networks. And so that's nothing to do with renewable energy necessarily. So if I take a gas network, for example, if you came to me as a gas company and said, I need to invest in an electric compressor instead of a gas compressor because I'm trying to meet my emissions reduction objective, then that's something that we couldn't consider necessarily under the existing obligations. And so under a future set of arrangements, that's something we could consider. So it's not necessarily about wind and solar. It's about lots of little choices that go along in this system to make sure it all adds up to the least cost way of meeting our climate goals.
So if the ministers, past and present, are not lying, if solar and wind are cheap and reliable, it would fit into existing objectives of price and reliability. Why do we need to change the objectives if the climate ministers are not lying?
So as I just said, Senator, and I'll repeat my answer, it's not always about wind and solar. Sometimes it'll be about networks. And in fact, most of the changes to the objective for the work of the Australian Energy Regulator will be about transmission, distribution, electricity and gas networks.
So it won't be about price versus emissions, yet everywhere in the world, every country that has a substantial proportion of solar and wind has had a dramatic increase in prices. That's fact. That is fact.
Are you asking me a question,
Yes,
Senator?
I'm asking you a question. How can you justify the statement that there won't be a trade-off between emissions and price?
So I think I'd just covered that in the question before, which was that we'll be optimising across the new emissions reduction objective with the other elements of the national electricity and gas objectives.
What's the Australian Energy Regulator's position on nuclear energy?
We don't have a position on nuclear energy, Senator.
So now you're impartial.
We're always impartial, Senator.
Okay.
Last question, Senator Roberts.
You say as part of your retail energy market regulation that your other roles include, secondly, reporting on performance of the market and energy businesses, including energy affordability and disconnection of customers for non-payment of energy bills. What's the latest disconnection rate in each state? Could you take that on notice?
I can tell you at the macro level, and I can take the state-based data on notice, but for this current year, 21-22, which is the last full financial year of data we have, the number of disconnections was about 30,000. That is significantly less than what we were seeing before COVID. At the time before COVID, it was about 70,000 customers a year.
Could you take it on notice to give us the
state-by-state breakdown?
The 5 years?
Yes.
Well, actually, 3 years.
I've got the 5 year
3 years.
here at the macro level, if you'd like it, Senator.
I'd like to know the states as well, please, because I want to see how different states are behaving.
Oh, I have got the states here.
Okay.
Would you like me to read them out?
If you could put it on writing, that'd be good, thanks.
It's about 20, as you can imagine, it ends up being about 20 numbers.
But look,
I wonder if we would just copy it in the break and circulate it. just for ease. Is that okay with you, Senator Roberts?
That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. But at a cumulative total in 17-18 it was 72,000, in 2018-19 it was 70,000. The Australian Energy Regulator then asked retailers to stop disconnecting customers during COVID, so we saw a big drop down, 43,000 in 1920, 17,000 in 2021, and then it's back at 29,000 in 21-22.
Thank you.
Thank
We'll
you.
get a copy.
Yep.
Senator